we thought it was very important to highlight this. What we're about to show you is Admiral Mike Mullen. Some of you might know him. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Bush and President Obama. Now, look, I'm not going to lie to you. He has a mixed record. On Afghanistan, didn't exactly tell us the truth. That being said, I followed him a lot in the days of the Syrian civil war, Krystal, because even at that time, he was always pushing back against hawks who wanted to create a no-fly zone over Syria because he wanted to avoid conflict with Russia. And he gave a very eye-opening interview, the first likes of which I have ever seen on national television, in which he was very clear with the American people about what Putin needs to be taken seriously on, what exactly the nuclear threat consists of, and what the avenue for the U.S. should be. The reason why I think it's important is that this is a former head of the entire United States military, chief military advisor to the president, advocating not for military action like David Petraeus and other 4 stars that was seen on TV after, but instead for diplomatic negotiations. Let's take a listen.
How do you assess the nuclear threat from Russia right now?
Well, I have to take Putin seriously. He's got lots of options with tactical nuclear weapons from very low-yield nuclear weapons. He's I believe, a cornered animal, and I think he's more and more dangerous, just what's happened in the last 24 hours. It also speaks to the need, I think, to get to the table. I'm a little concerned about the language, which we're about at the top, if you will.
President Biden's language.
President Biden's language with respect to how it all ends. And that really is up to, I think, Tony Blinken and other diplomats to figure out a way to get both Zelensky and Putin to the table. And as is typical in any war, it's got to end. And usually there are negotiations associated with that.
So there are a couple of noteworthy things that he says. Number one, take Putin's threat of nuclear weapons seriously. Number two, calling out President Biden for his nuclear Armageddon language. Although on that one, I've seen that the hawks are basically like, Biden shouldn't be so hyperbolic. I'm like, well, what if he's not being hyperbolic? What if he was real? What if that's what he believes? You know, I said this yesterday, Krystal, I think we should reiterate it again. The idea that you can make your most fulsome comments about how the entire earth may be destroyed behind closed doors, not on camera, in front of a bunch of rich billionaires, and everybody's just supposed to accept that, when in reality, if the risk is that high, you need to sit your ass in the Oval Office and give a direct address to camera on exactly what the threat is, what the United States will do, and everything I am doing in order to mitigate that threat.
Well, and this is where with Biden, I mean, it almost is, it's sort of very Trumpian, where you never know how much is him just like off the cuff saying some shit that he really shouldn't say, but that he actually thinks, and how much of it is like planned down, intentional messaging and strategy. I don't know. You know, I mean, my instinct is this is just, you know, he's in a room, he's talking, he's Joe, he's even before the mental decline, he's always had sort of verbal diarrhea and said things he's not really supposed to say. So my instinct is it was more of that kind of a situation where he accidentally let loose what he really thinks, even as clearly many other people in the administration are trying to avoid saying any of this publicly whatsoever. Why? Because if you acknowledge that we are right now in a position where we could face potential nuclear Armageddon, it begs a lot of questions about how the hell exactly we got here. So that's the reason why he doesn't want to give that fulsome, direct speech comments to the American public, because to acknowledge that we've allowed ourselves to get in this place is to acknowledge that there were potential catastrophic failures along the way. We know that the American people would like to see diplomacy. The views that are expressed by Mike Mullen here are very mainstream, even though if you express them, you know, on Twitter or other places, you'll be absolutely dogpiled as a Russian sympathizer and all this sort of stuff. But, you know, the reality is, if you want to end this conflict without having overt World War III, we're already in sort of like low-key World War III, but overt World War III and a potential nuclear exchange, at some point people are going to have to come to the table. Now, it feels like we are right now a long way from getting to that place. So then that begs the question, what do we do to change the conditions to enable that sort of serious sit down where at least you could get to a ceasefire, at least you could come to some sort of an understanding or détente to de-escalate this situation rather than what we continue to see week after week after week is a little more escalation, a little more escalation, a little more escalation. I mean, we just learned, let's not forget that this is already sort of like fallen out of the news, but we just learned the Ukrainians assassinated a Russian citizen in Moscow using a car bomb. So those sorts of, tactics are apparently being deployed by the Ukrainians. The U.S. intelligence community says without our consent may or may not be the case ultimately, but this is a really dangerous game that we're playing every single week that it goes on.
All it takes is one thing to go wrong. That car bomb didn't even kill the right person. So they didn't even kill, okay, now what? It's like, what if you killed somebody who's higher up the food chain? What if you start assassinating children? People start to go crazy. I mean, look, all of this is 100% on the table. There's the final thing that I think that Admiral Mullen said was, notice who he said should bring people to the table. He said Tony Blinken. He named the United States Secretary of State because Admiral Mullen is not an idiot, and he understands that the U.S. and really only the U.S. has the convening power with these two powers that are involved in this war to actually get some sort of facilitation at the table. And, I think that this cannot be overstated. America is the only country on earth that has the capability to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table because they literally do not function as a polity without us. We pay their bills and balance their budget. I don't think people even understand that their entire economy and currency would collapse without the United States, given the amount of economic assistance. Two, their war effort is 100% dependent on U.S. Like, in terms of overall military aid and materiel, it all comes from us. So, at that point, you have a tremendous say over the conflict. And I was really heartened to hear Admiral Mullen say that because he has actual cachet amongst the so-called decision makers. I will say though, there's always been wars over like who has respectability and who doesn't. And we have to be honest, like his view is not very popular here in Washington. But I'm starting to see a couple of things break through. Actually, just this morning in the Financial Times, a guy named Alexander Gabuev, he's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He came out with the same thing. The risks of escalation in the Ukraine war are rising fast. No comprehensive settlement is possible, but the U.S. must start laying the groundwork for crisis diplomacy.
You said you saw Congressman Ro Khanna, who I believe we have on the show on Thursday, actually, making similar noises, which is also noteworthy that there would even be a perception that there would be any space in the conversation to say that at this point.
Yeah, so I think that the tide is beginning to break for what we have been saying here on the show for a long time. But we also can't overstate, I'm talking about two voices or three voices in a sea of 10,000 who rule Washington. Don't ever forget there's more Ukrainian flags in the city than there are American flags.
You're absolutely 100% correct, though, that the initiative really does have to come from the U.S. I mean, there's just no other way that this is ultimately going to work out. I mean, we saw the way that this happened the last time there were any sort of peace negotiations. The U.S. and the U.K. basically said, no, we're not down with this, and that was the end of it. So if it doesn't come from the U.S. and from some sort of initiative from our side, there is no possibility whatsoever. So I hope that Biden's little realizations about World War III and potential nuclear Armageddon maybe makes him a little more serious about figuring out how we could get to that place. Not that that is an easy thing to figure out how to engineer whatsoever.
We'll see. Inshallah, as they say in the Arab world.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.